Welcome. My name is David Denton, and I'm new in the School of Education at SPU. I'm presenting on how to create rubrics, and I have the unique opportunity to teach about assessment to graduate students. So on the one hand, I teach students how to use rubrics, and then I also use them to assess students in my own courses. So I use them, which is really helpful, but I also teach about them, which is even more helpful. First, I'd like you to take a moment to define rubrics for yourself, perhaps by pausing this video and doing a bit of brainstorming or research online. Great. What did you think about? Well, here's a definition by Andrade. Let me read it aloud. A rubric is a scoring tool that lists the criteria for a piece of work, or what counts. For example, purpose, organization, details, voice, and mechanics are often what count in a piece of writing. It also articulates gradations of quality for each criterion from excellent to poor. How does it compare to your definition? Is it missing anything? Perhaps it's too long. Now let's conduct a bit of formative assessment. Ask yourself, how have you used rubrics? Have you created them? What about using Blackboard's rubric function? Here are some advantages and disadvantages of rubrics. Let me discuss some general characteristics of each category. While I do, think about which advantage is most appealing to you and which disadvantage is least appealing. First of all, rubrics provide a criteria for judging. They eliminate the ambiguity around an assignment for students. They also establish the criteria of performance, helping students understand what it is they're supposed to do, how the assignment's scored, and what's of most value. Rubrics can be done through teacher and student collaboration. That is, the assessment doesn't have to be done at the end of the course, but rather you could have students practice with the rubric, self-assess their own assignment, or perhaps peer assess, in order to improve upon what they've created. Rubrics can be analytical, that is, specific accounting for each characteristic, or more holistic, which is about the overall view of the product that the students made. And also, rubrics lend themselves to additional feedback. Some disadvantages include the time it takes to make a rubric, especially if you have a new assignment and you want to create a new rubric for it. Another disadvantage is that rubrics tend to make these students converge on a specific product, so you may perhaps get many forms of the same thing, which is not all that bad if there's something specific you have in mind that you want the students to create. But if you're looking for creativity and innovation, you may want to think carefully about how you create the rubric so that you don't get as much convergent production in that case. Another problem, and this goes for assessment in general, is drift. You've probably experienced this. Drift happens when you're scoring student assignments and you get tired of scoring them, and you tend to elevate scores in order to make the process go a little faster. You drift away from those criteria that you've established because you become saturated with the process. You can avoid drift by grading a little bit at a time. Another disadvantage is that they can be analytic or holistic. I tend to be more analytical when I construct rubrics, so that I'm counting specific characteristics, but that can be a disadvantage because you miss the overall look of a product, the overall quality of a product if you're too analytical, so perhaps a balance there. And if you provide feedback on the rubric as well as on the product or paper itself, then that sort of doubles up or duplicates perhaps the amount of feedback that you're having to create. So these are some implications to think about as you create rubrics and use them for your own class. Here are some proposed steps by Andrade for creating and using rubrics. First, analyze examples. Now we could take this in one of two ways. One way is to consider example rubrics that have already been created and used by other instructors. Another way is that you consider student products, let's say for instance essays. You would want to examine student essays and extract from those example student essays, specific criteria that you value, that you would want to apply to your own assignment. And I've done both approaches. On the one hand, I've looked at rubrics and created assignments around those, and on the other hand, I've looked at student examples or products and then created a rubric from that method. And both of those can be useful. It just depends on your goals and how much you have time for. I'd recommend that you try both. These days, I'm a little more amenable, a little more favorable to looking at examples of student work and then creating the rubric around that. But that takes time. Perhaps you have to go through the assignment once or twice to understand what it is that is really good about that essay or that student product that you're having them make. And then list the criteria. So whatever it is the student's doing, you want to list off the criteria. So for instance, in a piece of writing, grammar, mechanics, and so forth. Articulate gradations, and plenty of adjectives come in handy here. For example, adjectives such as always, frequently, sometimes, or never. Those are gradations that you can include on the rubric, and you'll want to have a few sets of those to apply to each criteria. Have students practice using the rubric. Now this assumes that the student has some sort of rough draft and they can take the rubric and apply it. And initiate some peer and self-assessment. Now this is where I think rubrics are very useful, that instead of applying the rubric at the end of class when the student has turned in this, that, or the other project, have students peer and self-assess before they turn in their final summative project for evaluation. Have them self-evaluate with the rubric. Have them assess their peers as well. If there's time, have students revise their projects to bring them more in alignment with what the rubric shows. And then finally, your work is to assess the student artifact with the rubric. So these are just some suggestions. I think the most complex of the steps are the first two, which is essentially creating or establishing the rubric and understanding what it is that you want to see the students create. And I would encourage you to keep in mind that it's a process. For instance, the rubrics I developed for a class this year, I envision revisiting and revising for a couple of years in a row, and I'll include students in that revising process during the next quarter I teach the class. So think of it as an ongoing process where you're improving the rubric and bringing it just to the point of near perfection, but that of course takes time. Let me re-emphasize one of the qualities that I like about rubrics. One of the reasons I like using them is that they eliminate most of the ambiguity around assignment expectation. So that miscommunication that sometimes can happen, students don't exactly understand what it is that you want them to do, much of that can be eliminated with some careful thought on your rubric. For instance, what this student Marcus has to say. If you get something wrong, she said, your teacher can prove you knew what you were supposed to do. So in this case, Marcus is suggesting that the ambiguity of an assignment is eliminated somewhat with, or mostly with rubrics. Now let's take a look at some example rubrics. Now this first one is from AACU. It's called a value rubric. And AACU has developed a number of rubrics for their students, and I'm going to take you to that website and show you a few more in a moment. But this is the general format, columns and rows. The criteria are here in this column, and then the levels of accomplishment across the top. This particular rubric has not only words but numerical values assigned to the columns, so I've used both words and or numbers. So let's spend a minute and explore some of the rubrics through AACU. Here we go. Now you may be prompted to send your email, but I wouldn't hesitate to do that. I've signed up for an account here with AACU, and I never receive anything from them, so that's perfectly fine, I think, to give your email out. But anyway, there's a number of very interesting rubrics, and I've used pieces of these rubrics, not the whole rubric in its entirety, but pieces of the rubric to create my own, and I've done some very good work here. For instance, on critical thinking, there's a Word and PDF version. I'll just open the PDF. And some description here, glossary, which can be very helpful. But then some really terrific thinking on their part. So, for instance, evidence, use of evidence to support arguments, capstone. Information is taken from sources with enough interpretation and evaluation to develop a comprehensive analysis and synthesis. And then they go down a step in this next gradation. So here are some very good examples if you want to create a new rubric to follow, and you can lift this text right off the page and insert it into your own rubric. I tend to modify a little bit, but at any rate, these value rubrics I think you'll find very insightful and useful. Here's one on written communication, oral communication, reading, and so forth. So I would encourage you to explore those. Here's another example. I used this one to assess students on their understanding of problem-based learning through the creation of a website. Notice the percentages that run down on this criteria column as well as across. You'll need to think about these percentages as gradations of effectiveness on the production of whatever it is students are making. So for me, exemplary is 100% and proficient is 85%, and so on. And this column will add up to 100%. So I've weighted each of these criterion, the most important being application of problem-based learning for this particular project, 35%, and then fluency with web-based applications, 15%, and so on. So you'll need to consider these types of variations for the criteria and what percentage is worth what. You probably noticed that the previous example had many words in each individual cell, and I think that can be a problem for students in attempting to interpret those words and what it is that you want them to do. However, an alternative is to keep your rubric simple, and I'll admit that I haven't explored this characteristic of a rubric as thoroughly as I should, but it's something I'm interested in investigating. Think about using student-friendly language that resonates with where the students are at with regard to applying the rubric to their assignment. I tend to make rubrics that are more analytical. For example, I tell students to indicate at least 3 citations in APA format, and I can count 3 citations in APA format on a paper. And this is all to the good, but sometimes it misses conveying the meaning of the criterion. I might rewrite the citation criterion to say support arguable statements with APA citation to better get at the spirit of that criterion. And here again in example 3 you see some rather student-friendly language, I think, that's more easily interpreted than probably what you previously saw in that other example. So for instance, did I get my audience's attention? Creative beginning, boring beginning, or no beginning? Perhaps it's overly simplistic, but I think that many students would understand this description, maybe more easily than something that's verbose with many words and lots of description, or perhaps too much description. So let me encourage you to think about using student-friendly language in your rubrics and to experiment a bit with this idea. Let's summarize the steps for making rubrics. Begin by analyzing examples, either example rubrics that already exist or example assignments that you've had students create take those example assignments or rubrics, list off the criteria that you value, 4 or 5. 6 is getting a bit long, I think, but at the maximum 6, and anything above that's probably too many criteria. Identify gradations with lots of adjectives such as always, mostly, sometimes, or never. Consider the format. I like to type up my rubrics in an Excel spreadsheet or in Microsoft Word with a table on that document so that I can easily manage and modify the rubric. If you're including students in part of the assessment process, which I recommend, have students practice with the rubric. Have them peer and self-assess their own products, say, for example, an essay. Have them peer and self-assess that essay before the actual summative assessment that you'll be giving them. Have students revise their work. As you begin the grading process, you'll need to establish some anchor papers, and this is an important step I hadn't mentioned in the previous slides. Anchor papers will serve you to illustrate and remind you what's an exemplary product or something that is not so exemplary. So what you might want to do is take all, let's say, again we're using the example of an essay, take all of the essays, identify the one that is the very best and the one that is not so good, and utilize those as anchor papers. Score those first and establish in your mind the very best outcome, the very best product, and the one that's not that great. And then periodically revisit those anchor papers or anchor products as you score to help you avoid that idea of drift. You remember drift? That's where you essentially get tired of scoring and you drift away from the criteria and start giving out more points perhaps than you should, and I'm certainly guilty of that. So establishing anchor papers, something to think about. And then of course just assessing the products. So let's go through a practice example. This website, Rubistar for Teachers, is really very useful. It doesn't look very professional from the get-go, but I think that if you're creating rubrics, you'll find it extremely powerful in the sense that you don't have to start from scratch. I don't think I've ever created a rubric from scratch. So I would encourage you to investigate this website if you're creating a new rubric or want to modify one you have. Well, for purposes of example, let's say that we're going to have students make websites. So I might start by thinking about a rubric, and here's one for website design, and you can see that this website has all kinds of products and disciplines, so you'll want to investigate that thoroughly if you're creating a rubric. Website design. Now, it's asking for some information. I don't have to give that. I'll scroll down. And I can use these drop-down boxes to fill in some of the criterion that I'm interested in. So perhaps, let's see, graphics. Okay, and then what it gives me is some content here in these cells, various gradations. And as I mentioned, I like to take my rubric and put it into an Excel spreadsheet so that I can save it and modify it. So what I'll do is I'll begin with this content from Rubistar, and I'm just going to copy and paste it over into my spreadsheet. And I'll do this for the criteria that I'm interested in. And I'll continue to choose criteria and fill in the cells as I work down through my rubric. So I think you get the idea here. And of course there are all kinds of rubrics to work with through this website. So again, you don't have to start from scratch. In fact, it would be much more challenging if you were to start from scratch. So I would recommend searching out some rubrics that have already been created and then coming back and modifying those a bit. Well, in our steps we discussed this idea of analyzing examples and also establishing anchors. So now that we have our rubric in place and our assignment description and all that, We might want to analyze some examples, in fact, before we even create the rubric or the assignment description, or collect assignments over time that we've given students, and then just gather the very best examples and some of the not so best examples that we can use as examples to share with students, as well as for anchor papers. So let's return to this example of creating websites. I want to find some example websites that are not very good. Now, I could go search for some, and here you can see some. I'll show some in a moment. But if you're giving students an assignment, then you could probably collect these examples for yourself over time. So for instance, I've saved some assignments from last quarter, and I'll utilize these as examples of student work, as well as anchor papers. So here's one that it's a little bit too much color, I guess. Some people might enjoy this, but there's some Greek down here. I suppose there's some positive attributes of that, but it's a little bit much. Here's another one that just seems to be just this. Contact information. I think there's some sort of animation that plays, but it's not playing now, so this one's not very good either. Here's another one that has a lot to be desired. I just don't even know where to begin with this one. It's just so filled. Although it is visually interesting, it's a little bit distracting. So these would serve as anchor papers of what not to do with creating a website. And I might even extract characteristics from these, such as too brightly colored, too much content, and so forth, for use on my rubric. Likewise, I'm going to want to have anchors and examples of the very best. So again, I can go outside of my own files and search for these things, but if you're teaching a particular class and giving an assignment, I imagine over a couple of quarters you could collect your own examples. But here's some pretty good websites, and visually appealing, and for the most part simple. Another one, I don't even know what the content of this is, but it looks intriguing to me, especially the diagram, the flow chart here. And a third, and this one is particularly interesting because of its simplicity and buttons and so forth. I like the diagram here and picture. So I would extract criteria also from the very best examples, and you can tell that having examples of good and bad really lends itself to the creation of the rubric, to not only extract characteristics but anchor that scoring, as I talked about, and to help avoid drift. Well, here are a few more tips I would really encourage you to consider, which is to construct the rubric with student input. It's a little counterintuitive, but to include students in the assessment process, I think it's very powerful. For instance, last quarter I assigned a project and associated a rubric with it, and it had 5 criteria. I got 2 of the criteria. I got to fill in those sections, and that was 50% of the scoring. Students owned the other 3, and they got to decide on those criterion and also the percentage distribution. Present a draft for discussion and possible edits. So a rubric can be in flux and changeable perhaps over the period of the course. Give time for peer and self-assessment. So have students assess their work midway through the quarter or 3/4 of the way through class, and have them make revisions. Use the rubric formatively as a checkup. So here's a rubric I used, and I just added a couple of additional columns or rows rather for students, so that they could write some peer and self-assessment on these categories. And I think this was useful. I watched students make revisions and improvements to their projects because of this process, and just clarifying what it is I wanted and what was a quality product and not so quality. So this was helpful, and we did this in class. Another tip is to to not start from scratch. Use websites like Rubistar or AACU's Value Rubrics. Use those as a place to begin. Type your rubric into a spreadsheet or Word document so that you can save it and modify it over time and also proofread it. The next few tips are specific to using the rubric in Blackboard, which I would really encourage you to do because it will make your scoring much more efficient. And one tip that I discovered was to set up your columns and rows in Blackboard before you put in any content. So you'll start off with 3 columns, and then if you need to add a column, that certainly can be done. You can see here that I've done that. But you'll notice the percentages are a little out of order. So one tip, and David will readdress this when he's talking about how to use rubrics in Blackboard, but just set up the columns and rows first and then start filling in the content, and that seemed to save me a bit of work down the road. Something else in Blackboard is to carefully read the options. When you associate a rubric with an assignment, there are different options for how students see that rubric, and I think you want to be open and transparent about the rubric. So there are some drop-down boxes when you put that rubric to an assignment, and you want to show that rubric with scores. Otherwise, students may not be able to see it, and you certainly do want them to see it. So just carefully check and read all of those options as you associate the rubric with an assignment. And again, David will address this in his portion of the presentation. I would also suggest distributing electronic or paper copies. Of course, if you've linked a rubric to an assignment in Blackboard, students can see it, but I've also noticed that students won't always click around to find it. So if you can be very explicit about distributing that rubric, I think students find that helpful. And then a few resources for you. The Value Rubrics, which you could just simply Google, and Rubistar for teachers, and SPU owns an e-book of Shermis and Divesta's book, Classroom Assessment in Action, which talks more about rubrics. So I would encourage you to take a look at those resources as well.